Hello, everyone. Greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are today. This is our third installment into the series Journey into Agile with Inflectra, and we will be focusing today on Agile engineering practices for software product development. These are some of the practices that I have found over a long period of time, and I'm sharing those as a foundational principles and how they extend the Agile engineering practices. I hope you are able to hear me fine. And with that assumption, I'm going to move forward. So for those of you that know me already, my name is Sriram Rajagopalan. I am serving as the Enterprise Agile Evangelist at this point with Inflectra. For my education, I have a doctorate in organizational leadership and management, MBA in management, MS in computer engineering, and a bachelorate in electronics and communication engineering. I went through this full life cycle. I started my career as a software engineer, progressed along as a team leader, business analyst, project manager, scrum master, agile coach, and I have served in the capacity of director and vice president as well. I have a number of different certifications to my credential, which include portfolio management, program management, project management, risk management, agile, scrum master, scrum product owner, scrum developer, agile coach, Six Sigma black belt, and a number of other things among being an instructional designer, speaker, writer, and author. I also have corporate training and academic teaching experience in a number of colleges across US, India, and Vietnam. Now, this webinar today is going to be part of a 4-part series on the third webinar installment. So Journey into Agile with Inflectra number 3, and we are going to focus on first webinar within that series. Each webinar is approximately 1 hour long, including the time for Q&A. So we will reserve time at the end for questions. And if possible, I may illustrate the webinars with a concept. But in today's webinar, I may not be using any particular tool. So the 4 webinars that we have scheduled in this episode of Journey into Agile with Inflectra number 3 is today we will be focusing on Agile engineering practices for software development. And then before the end of the year on December 17th, we will be focusing on writing good user stories. And then the patterns to avoid in Agile ceremonies will be discussed on January 9th, 2020. And then incorporating some of the lean and Kanban principles in product lifecycle management, we will discuss this on January the 23rd next year. So first, let's get grounded on what product management is. Frequently, especially with the growing emphasis on agile principles, Scrum, Kanban, Lean, DSDM, XP, along with project delivery frameworks like PMBOK and Prince2, there seems to be a lot of thinking moving towards, if you are able to have an idea, go through the prototype development and have iterations and releases, you are actually starting to think in terms of product management. That's not necessarily completely true, because product lifecycle management starts with understanding the market needs from the field. In other words, the holistic system level thinking has to be present as to why do we need this particular product now, why now, at what cost are we planning to build it, and what's the business impact if you do not do this. That level of SWOT analysis has to be supplemented by additional concepts like political, economical, societal, technical, legal, ethical, environmental, and demographic kind of analysis. And that takes you to actually the product management concept as to what are the market needs, what is the business case for this particular product, how much money are we planning to spend, how much of a horizon do we have, and things like that. And then we need to start coming down with what is called a benefits register, which is going to start in providing the incremental, consolidated, and coordinated benefits that we may probably want to have as part of this initiative. And from there comes the product roadmap, combination of those things. So product management is focusing on this constantly, right? And that alone is not going to be sufficient. And so you need to have certain criteria developed. And that's when you are coming down with the funding considerations in terms of how it will be funded and how much it will be funded, what kind of milestones are expected by a certain time period so that we can continue to procure funding subsequently. And there is always going to be this business priority because a number of things are going to be constantly changing. Resources will be changing both in terms of the human resources as well as the other resources like facilities, equipment, material, infrastructure, and supplies. Those will change too. And how do you continuously sustain the benefits that you have generated at this point? And those things are supposed to be considered as part of your product management, which feeds into the product development concepts. And that alone is not going to be, again, sufficient. And so you need to actually have a product marketing. So product marketing is now that I have a product, how do I market it for, reach? How do I make sure that, I'm designing it for constant engagement? How is my marketing plan going to look like? This could include demographics or digital marketing plan or many other user-centric behaviors and things like that. And then finally, the ongoing public relations. How do you manage that? And all these things are supposed to be part of the product management. And the main thing is product development is part of this entire life cycle. Right from the time you have a project or a product idea, how do you move forward with the plan? How do you move forward with the development? How do you create appropriate prototype to get the funding to move forward? The business case actually established, and then how do you continuously develop this in an iterative and incremental fashion up until the product launch? Excuse me. And then how do you get feedback from the input to continuously enhance it through multiple iterations and multiple releases? And how do you, continue this entire life cycle? This whole thing is product development, but then product management comes in from a strategic side. Product development comes from both strategic and tactical and operational sides to actually bring everything together. So a lot of times when we start thinking in terms of technical excellence in product management, we focus completely onto the product development technical aspects alone, but that's not necessarily true. You have to think from a life cycle standpoint. Now, based upon some of my foundations, what I do find is a number of times the technical foundation product that we have, the AWS or the Azure or, whatever organic platform that you have upon which you are actually building a lot of product, the portfolio of product suites and things like that. So that itself should be treated like a product, like most like a sub-product or a product within your, your portfolio. Now, if you do not do that, you expect the product manager or the product owner to always come with business value and customer value stories, but who is going to actually add the technical value stories and the process value stories? The project manager or the product owner is not necessarily going to be that person. So the technical architect, the designer, those members should actually treat their own technical platform as a product and must have a vision for that. And that vision for that particular technical platform should be aligned with the actual commercially viable product that you are planning to develop. Because at the end of the day, if the commercially viable platform is not necessarily going to adhere to your technical platform, then there is all these quality principles that are going to be shaken and things will not work out. So the platform should be treated like a technical prerequisite, and product thinking should be continuously thought for the platform itself. So the architect should become more like a technical product owner who is working collaboratively with the product owner or the project manager to continuously move forward. And that symbiosis is very much required for agile technical excellence to excel well. So now that we have talked about those two things, let's talk about what is the engineering versus development, because frequently these two things are continuously thought of as though they are synonymous. They're not synonymous. Now, when you look at from an engineering side of things, they are looking at trend analysis. Like, we did this. How is this particular functionality working in the platform? How do customers work with these features? What are the additional things that we can constantly do? And that kind of a trend analysis from a technical standpoint, not necessarily from a commercial business standpoint alone, has to be thought through. So there has to be this discussion between the technical architects and the product owners. Along with that, they have to start thinking in terms of the risk management. Like, what are some of the things that we will do which will have potentially problematic effects down the road. So thinking from that risk aspect, you are already thinking in terms of what should you avoid and what should you include. So when you look at these concepts, this is when the DSDM principles of Vasco and all those things, return on investment, all those things continuously come into play. And then the third thing is going to be the prescriptive solution. So based upon your own intel from the different groups that you are attending, from the networking seminars and all these other things, you are basically coming down with an approach of, there are a lot of people who are doing this. If you don't do this, we are going to be falling behind. As a result, we have to come with these prototypes, experiment them, and then come down with the prescriptive solutions. And that concept leads into the development side of the equation, where people start looking in terms of specific patterns. So for every time there is a specific problem coming, what is the root cause of this particular issue? What could have contributed to this? How do I make sure that good solid patterns exist to avoid these problems right from the beginning, so that you are being proactive rather than reactive? And then as a result of this, you are promoting good practices across the entire team. This could be coding practices, test-driven development, and all those other things. But you are promoting constantly different practices across the team. And the team is going to be not necessarily a static team. People are people, and they will have different life coming in their way. As a result, you have to have these practices reinforced constantly. So Kaizen approaches have to come into play at this point. And then finally, experimental innovation, setting aside some time for people to actually come down with new ideas and experiment them as to how this product could be better, how it could be performing, more securely, or how it could be sustaining well, and things like that. So those things have to constantly come into play as part of your technical value add and process value add stories, so that they feed into the commercial customer value add stories and business value add stories. So when you look at these aspects from an engineering point of view, the skills and competencies in scientific methods, like coming up with an hypothesis, using data analytics to come down with predictive and prescriptive intelligence, those kind of things are really required from an engineering standpoint for product development. Whereas when it comes to the development side of the equation, continuous learning from every retrospective and lessons learned as to how you are getting better and better and better. And this has to be through multiple channels, because when you take into product management, software product development, you are looking, as I mentioned before, across the life cycle and not just one iteration or one release. You are also taking input from the product marketing, product management, and then bridging the gap over here in terms of how you are doing it better. So these engineering and development more or less are two eyes of the same face. One without the other is not going to give you the depth of perception that you need. So both are critical, but both serve different purposes. There should be, a good synergy between both of them. Now that we got that one out of the equation, so let's go into some of the agile engineering practices. So the latest survey, the State of Agile survey that version 1 publishes, I have compared it for 3 years, 2017, 18, and 19. Now, these three bars, first you are seeing 2019, 2018, and then 2017. So that's the order. So the descending order by reverse chronology is what I have used here. Now, when you look at these things, there are certain practices that is constantly evolving as part of this agile surveys that people are doing. So unit testing, and they are not listed in any particular order, but the most important things that people are trying to promote are unit testing, coding standards, continuous integration, refactoring, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, pair programming, test-driven development, automatic acceptance testing, collaborative code ownership, and sustainable pace, behavior-driven development, and emergent design. So when you look at these practices, certain patterns evolve over here. So when you look at these things, the green arrows are indicating some of the good practices that are evolving at this point. So emergent design. So as you are trying to look at how you look at these design patterns and modify them based upon how they are performing in the field, that's actually evolving. So you are seeing an uptick from 15 to 21%, especially now. And if you look at the behavior-driven development, they are looking at more persona, creating more persona, and coming up with the acceptance criteria for them, and using those things to come up with different ways of testing the system. So that is also evolving, 16 to 22%. And continuous delivery, which is like pushing the code more and more to pseudo production environment, that's also constantly increasing. Now these are good practices to monitor, but on the other hand, these graphs do tell a different story as well. So let's take a look at some of those things. The red arrows are telling that particular story. Now, let me look at the unit testing. So unit testing is seeming to be reducing. So it was about 74% in 2017. There was a small uptick, and then it fell down to 69%. And again, this is a survey, depends upon how many people are taking it. Different patterns and things go into the survey itself. But ignoring all those things and looking just strictly at this information as a number, as a percentage reported, there is a pattern developing here. Perhaps the technical tools that we are using are having more and more intelligence built into them, and so unit testing is reducing, but that's just an interpretation and extension of idea, not necessarily a proof, right? Now, if unit testing is truly reducing, then if you look at refactoring, that's also reducing. So refactoring is the concept of how you actually look at the code and modify them to do better and be stable and go secure and all those things. So that is actually reducing from 52% to 41%. So that slip could be contributing to the unit testing. So these two may be working together because people are not necessarily having time to do the unit testing, and people don't have enough time to do the actual refactoring, and so more and more they are focusing on let's do customer stories, and there is no technical ownership. Now, when you look at the other aspects, the test-driven development, if test-driven development is constantly reducing from 40% to 33%, that means you cannot push code to a pseudo environment or a production-like environment. You cannot push it. And so that means continuous integration is going to fail, right? So you look at the 61% to 53%. So the combination of all these things is having an impact on how much we are moving forward with continuous integration. However, automated acceptance testing is actually reducing further too. From 36%, it has come down to 33%. Now, if you don't have automated acceptance testing, you don't have confidence in the code, and without the confidence in the code, you will not be able to automatically start pushing the code into the value delivery pipeline. So there are some changes that are coming up over here. There are some patterns that we need to actually start looking at this, and the root cause is probably an exhaustive study, but you have to start taking a look into these kind of things and say, how can I avoid these challenges and maximize the opportunities? So when you look at those aspects, the 12 agile principles that extreme programming borrowed and extreme programming promoted, that Agile Manifesto has actually adopted, are these things. You need to have face-to-face collaboration to increase the osmotic communication, trust the motivated team so that technical people and business people are working constantly. The team has to be self-organized, which means they have to have a skin in the game. And then, everything has to be simple. The design has to be simple. There needs to be a constant foundation of technical excellence. We need to increase value delivery, more frequently through iterative means. And ultimately, working software is the measure of progress. and we welcome change all the time, and we manage a sustainable pace, and we reflect and adjust our processes accordingly. So all these things are very simple agile practices, but how much do they actually translate into some of the technical foundational aspects? Now, here is where I'm bringing my experience over here. And based upon my experience, I'm basically saying some engineering patterns, if we adopt them early and if we do them very well, then we position the team to deliver both customer and business value consistently, because the technical and the process value story becomes the foundation upon which the customer value stories and business value stories are getting added. So I'm just going to quickly pause and see if there is somebody questioning me. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So just moving forward. So some of the 4 important engineering practices that I think we can adopt, which will improve this process, is number 1 is going to be focusing on the MVP, so the minimum viable product. At the end of the day, what's the business need and how are we actually addressing that particular minimum viable product? And then the second thing is avoiding unnecessary risks and building talent, promoting code ownership and things like that. And then holding everyone responsible for quality. So making sure that everybody is able to contribute to quality rather than dedicated individuals who is supposed to be responsible only for testing and building quality. So quality by definition is not by accident, it's by design. And then the last one is going to be building the value pipeline. How do you consistently build the value pipeline so that you are able to increase the confidence that you have in the software that you are consistently building? So this is the 4 steps, and these 4 steps I'm trying to expand at this point. So the first practice is supposed to be being strategic about the requirements gathering. So when somebody is giving the requirements, the focus has to be what's the business need and what's the business impact if we do not do this. If these 2 questions we are constantly trying to answer, we are getting to the importance of what is the absolutely minimum required information that we should add. So that's going to be the focus on the MVP. So how do we do that? First thing I am recommending is that we have to use what is called a hardening iteration. So iteration 0. Frequently, I have seen that being skipped or not necessarily implemented rightly. So some of the thought I'm suggesting is iteration 0 should be the one where we are focusing on building at least some backlog. If there is no backlog to work on, then there is really not much to deliver at this point. There needs to be some amount of effort spent in creating that backlog of value-added user stories that cater to the MVP. Okay, now how do we do that? So working with different people to make sure that we are agreeing on the MVP. And then we are coming up with what are some of the technical value and process value added stories that we should have. Because they are the foundation upon which your business stories are getting built. And then establish the priority and severity, based upon the Moscow principles or return on investment principles. However you are going to define, trying to come down with specific ideas as to how you define the priority of this, without which you will have a severity of impact. So trying to come down with that and build the important user stories. Right. The next one is going to be the team doesn't know each other or new to Agile. Even if the people are very well working together, if you suddenly throw Agile approaches, they don't succeed well. Because there is a lot of ownership and self-organization that is really required of them. And if they are not used to that kind of a mantra, then it's going to be very difficult. On the other hand, if people don't know each other, then trust is not building, and without the trust, self-organization will not necessarily develop. So some of the things that we should do over here is using the iteration 0 to have some kind of a icebreaker or introduce some of the principles of Agile that you will use, whether it is involving training or whether it is involving somebody else to come down with the specific things as to how we will adapt Agile and apply Agile. Emphasize self-organization principles so that people are not necessarily telling like, okay, the command and control approach, and they are actually embracing we are in this together. The together everyone achieves more mantra is actually getting developed over there. So those are some of the things that we have to do in the iteration 0. And then the working environment, has its own technical and human resource specific nuances. Depending upon that, you have to use what tools are we using and why. It's not necessarily that I use this tool and so this tool will be the best tool. Instead, for this particular thing, what will be the best tool we should use? Perhaps existing tools with some modifications. Perhaps existing tools are not the right way to go. So depending upon that particular approach, you have to start taking a look into, how do we train people? How do we, mentor and coach on these tools and techniques as to how people carry forward in the journey. And then getting people set up on appropriate platforms. So if you're using contractors and other consultants, maybe bringing them on board, making sure that they are all properly set up and all those things so that they are able to run productively when the iteration one starts, when the sprint one or iteration one starts. After all those things, they are as much possible productive as they can be. So making them set up for success, right? And finally, if the team is not co-located, let's face it, outsourcing and some of those concepts are here to stay. And so if a virtual team is being used by your business model, then it's not going to be conducive for co-location. And so some of the things that you have to come down with, probably establishing some team norms. If the hours of operation where you have your daily sprint or sprint backlog grooming or iteration planning is happening, it's not necessarily conducive for everybody to come or take part. What are some of the guidelines that you are going to establish in terms of team representation? And if they have a question, making sure that some dedicated time is available from the technical architect for support hours. And constantly looking for how do we improve engagement of every team member, because people co-location means they are going to withdraw, they may not necessarily contribute, and so you need to promote that engagement. So thinking of some thoughts in the iteration 0 from both the people, process, and technology standpoint will be a good start to get the project started on the right way and the processes moving forward. Okay, what are some of the results that we can expect from this? The first one is, we will avoid all these symptoms that we just basically said, or mitigate the risks of these symptoms as much as we can, if we cannot completely avoid it also. But we do see some agreement on the value. We try to emphasize what is absolutely required. And we promote the creativity, intellectual stimulation, and inspirational motivation. So we are able to come down with those concepts, and we are promoting the concept of individual commitments to the collaborative needs. So in other words, how every individual is going to be part of the team objectives. So we are trying to promote that approach, and then finally we are trying to move forward with an agreement towards the norms and guidelines. Coming up with appropriate challenges that we have to get resolved much before the actual daily sprint, or promoting different concepts that they have heard or they have experimented and things like that. So trying to come up with all these things. So we try to promote the team culture over here, and that's very critical as part of iteration 0. So that's one thing. And then the practice 2, avoiding risks and building talent. So I call this, practicing risk management proactively. So we try to avoid unnecessary defects and build talent towards succession planning. So some of the things that I'm promoting over here is foundational principles from lean thinking. And in lean thinking, there is this concept of 5 years. It goes like, SARI, which is for sort, and then Satan for straightening or putting things in order, and then say so for shining, work in progress or things getting done, and then Seiketsu for standardization, and finally Shitsuke for sustainment. I may not have properly pronounced the Japanese words, but sort, straighten, shine, standardize, and sustain are the way things go. So in the sort phase, you can start thinking in terms of, how do you remove incorrect coding principles? If people from different philosophies are coming together, how do you make sure that you're following some proper guidelines towards those things, things like that, and then remove writing code that will not be tested. This is the foundational approach as to how technical debt actually, even evolves. You write something with the hope that someday you will test it, but you're not testing it in that iteration, and that means you are actually, developing technical debt. So that's not something that you want to do. So you are making sure that you are already getting a grounded principles on that. And then stated, setting things in order. So for our initiative, for our project, what are some of the naming guidelines for variables, for methods, for constants, for all those things? How are you going to do it? Handshake of variables, within functions, all those things that you are actually talking about, and putting some guidelines together. And then include some of those modular design principles, like how are the functions closely related within the separate module, or how are the modules completely connected, so the cohesion and coupling. How do you hide information that other modules need not know, so more of an information hiding. Reusability of the code, extensibility of existing modules or libraries, portability across different platforms, so maintainability of the code that you have written. So all these things are ideas that you may want to start, telling much in advance, so that people think like, okay, all these things are expected of us, and it's not like a side thought, but it's actually a core requirement. And as you are moving forward, trying to shine on code documentation, trying to come up with some additional protocols that basically says, if you're doing certain things, make sure that you are writing some small amount of documentation as to why this module is added, what are you trying to do, and things like that, so that when somebody else in your absence is coming there, they are able to pick up the code from where you left off. And then promoting code check-in protocol, so that everything is properly checked in at the end of the day, or whatever you have agreed upon, and properly having some kind of tools. There are a number of tools that are available. You can actually incorporate those tools to actually evaluate how your progress is towards everyday work. If you are doing continuous integration, maybe having something that tells like how much code has been properly tested, how much code coverage exists, and things of that nature. And then standardize. So trying to come up with design principles, like, okay, how do you make sure that privacy related, compliance related, security related issues across the organization are all actually incorporated, and what are some of the engineering specific documentation that you may want to develop for any compliance audit that may be required. What are some of those engineering specific documentation that you may actually want to keep in place. And finally, feedback, sustain. Everything is good, but making sure that this whole process itself is actually open for feedback, as the progress is constantly moving, how things are getting updated, how things are evaluated, and things like that. As part of that, you incorporate the Kaizen principles, and feed those ideas back into the backlog, so that you are having time to actually review those things and properly have them factored in your iteration planning and subsequent releases as well. That's another approach that I have come down with. And how does this result translate? First of all, some of these minimally, these things actually improve the coding best practices. So as a team, everybody is agreeing on what are some of those naming guidelines, and the coding best practices are done. And then because of all these coding practices and coding documentation and all those things, and people talking about these things, there is also collective code ownership. So if one person does not show up, or one person is sick and things like that, you are still able to keep the momentum going, because everybody is able to contribute and provide feedback. So these is at a minimum, these two things are getting promoted. Then the practice number 3, everybody needs to be the quality champion. Quality is not responsible only for a dedicated group of people, but everybody should be responsible for good quality. So some of the things that I'm promoting over here is introducing the concept of the cost of quality. So from an architecture standpoint, review company policies. If privacy by certain security by particular standard of security is required, then make sure that you are including that. If some other team member has to actually review the protocols for how your code will be exposed in the cloud, how it should be encrypted, and those things, try to include those things as part of your architecture by expanding the stakeholders into your project, and then getting those information and then putting it into the backlog, and then you are moving forward. Right, that's part of your architectural review at this point. And then as part of your design and development, use as much as possible some of the pre-built components, so that if there is a problem, everything is isolated to that one problem, and any code that uses that problem will have the change once that particular issue is fixed. Use expertise on some of the new patterns that are evolving. And I will not go into the details of the patterns themselves, but what are some of those existing patterns that exist, and how do I actually bring them into my design and development approaches? And then design for X. So make sure that you are trying to say, okay, I want to have this particular module improved for security or for stability or for user interface or whatever it is. Try to think those design element much in advance, having a dialogue, and then bring those elements over here. So everybody should be able to contribute to that. And then coding quality, we have talked some of those already. Fix before writing any new code. So if there is a specific section of your code is actually having defects, before you write some other code in some other location, fix this. Because this is going to continuously build the technical debt again. And then promote code walkthroughs. Let everybody borrow in again here. This could be helpful for you to open up and get some feedback. And then avoid coding for the future. I already talked about this. That's going to be the technical debt aspect of it. And then pair with testers for test cases. So make sure that you are working with testers to actually build some additional test cases that you can write. As part of your test-driven development, you can basically make sure that you are able to address those issues much in advance. And then the engagement with the stakeholders. Require the product owners to test against the acceptance criteria. You may have your own program specific or coding specific acceptance criteria, but make sure that the customer specific acceptance criteria is tested by the product owners themselves. Come up with additional extreme persona who can interface with your product and see how you will be able to expand your products as a result of those things. So these things you can continue over the product life cycle. And try to include automated testing. So wherever there is an opportunity for you to automate, so that you don't need to necessarily write your own test cases repeatedly and do the testing yourself, see if you can actually automate those testing aspects of it. So if you're able to do these things over a period of time, you are increasing the cost of quality as well. Okay, and what are some of the results that this can manifest as? It could help with smaller releases, because now you are trying to come down with a fewer areas that needs to be done, fewer things that needs to be added. So you will be able to come with a sustainable pace where you can actually manage these releases, and as a result, you are trying to actually increase the value delivery as well. So repeatedly. And lastly, building the value pipeline. The value pipeline is the continuous integration, delivery, and deployment, but it needs to be sustainable too. So, some of the things that I'm promoting over here, which is, straightforward, but which I'm promoting that, technical members actually take into consideration, is going to be the continuous integration. So try to come up with those practices that we talked about, repeatedly checking stuff to the main branch, and then pre-built automated test for building and all those things. So with all those things, what you are trying to do is you are promoting the concept of early detection of defects. And once you have that, you have a little bit more time within your life cycle of the iteration to make sure that you have time for triaging it. So this avoids unnecessarily things getting outside of the iteration, moving into subsequent iteration and things like that, and improves your velocity as well. Excuse me. So one thing is, for continuous integration, there needs to be some investment also in terms of some specific domain or a platform integration environment where you are able to actually, do the check-in, because different people will be working on their own developer workstations. But all these codes have to be integrated into one area, one environment where these problems can be elevated much in advance. And then the continuous delivery, this is where you are trying to actually make sure that you are moving the needle towards pushing them to the customers. And it could be based upon the nature of your product. You cannot directly push it to the customer, but that may be interim set of releases that you have to do based upon the regulatory nature of products and things like that. But regardless of that, you can basically come down with how I'm going to build small batches of releases and push them into a completely different environment where I have a list of acceptance test scenarios. So here you are testing across the modules, checking against defects that may be breaking one module into other module and things that are not working and things like that. And you are also increasing the possibility of how you actually even automate the deployment process. This could still be into the a staging environment or a pre-production environment. Different people call differently, but that environment has to be present as well. And finally, continuous deployment. This is almost like pushing it to the live customers, completely getting it pushed and have some additional smoke test in the production environment that is there. So you are marching much towards the working software as a measure of good progress. This comes with an expense. So the environment has to be as close to the pre-production and staging environment, integration environment. When you have these things, this could be as close to the production environment as possible. Because if you are measuring some metrics like speed and all those things, production environment may have a different machine configuration compared to the other environments. So based upon these things, there is going to be some investment required as well. So this is another way where you are trying to push this. And as you saw, more and more we are moving towards these approaches, but we need to start thinking in terms of how you build them continuously. So the results of these three things are, in a number of ways, a number of books and articles and authors have talked about this, small releases, good, simple design, having a metaphor by which you are coming up with how you are going to test them or how you are going to release the value, proper sustainable pace, code ownership, value delivery, and more collaboration across multiple business stakeholders, automating the releases, and finally the working software. So these are some of the results. We are also, as part of all these things, promoting a number of other things that I have not even touched. So having a single source code repository that we need to have. Making sure that the build that we are building is also self-testable. So having those automated test scripts. And then promoting the source code commits to the main branch. Smaller life cycles and faster life cycle builds. Proper integration, good replica of those environments. And having those automated test scripts, which will also automate the build process. So all these things are also, something that I've been threading along all along. So some engineering principles are emphasized here for further demonstrate those things. So in a nutshell, the 4 important engineering practices that I am recommending as this way, focusing on MVP, avoiding risk and building talent, holding everyone accountable for quality, and finally building the value pipeline. As we are trying to do this, we are minimally at least contributing to these elements of sustainable pace, producing value early, iterative delivery, working software, technical excellence, and keeping it simple. So these are some of the foundational principles that we should definitely address as part of Agile Engineering. So at this point, I'm going to open up to the Q&A. So if there are any questions, please definitely talk to me at this point. There is also a second webinar coming, which will be on writing good user stories. So if you have not registered, I would recommend that you register for them. So let me see what I can do to open up. If you have any questions, please type them up so that I can unmute you and talk. Hi, anybody have any questions? Any thoughts?
الساعات
I'm having a lot of background noise.
قصدي ما تعرفش الجو شنو يصير قدامك.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Did you see my question?
I didn't see the question. Hold on.
Okay.
Where did you post the question? I didn't see the question in the chat window.
I can see my question in the chat window. I guess
Okay.
something. Anyway, yeah, I was wondering, have you used Agile in an R&D setting?
I'm seeing a lot of hearing a lot of background noise. I don't know who is talking. If you are not talking, can you please unmute yourself, please?
180 واجد.
Okay. Karin Ahmed, are you the one who was asking the question?
Yes.
Okay, so I tried to find out the other person who was speaking and I unmuted. Can you tell me what your question was? I couldn't hear the question at all.
Have you used Agile methodologies in an R&D setting? For example, scientific research and engineering environment.
In a scientific engineering environment, I have, but not in a scientific research. So I have developed applications for Federal Drug and Administration for pharmaceutical companies. So they have to go through certain process where you cannot completely develop until certain permissions are given and things like that. So I have used in that particular context. But if you probably ask me, a specific question, I may be able to answer that very clearly.
I'm just curious because I myself have tried to implement Scrum, and it did make a big difference. And we had 2-week iterations, but
Yes.
then we ended up using going to Kanban kind of thing because the, Scrum was a bit too rigid, and there was just too many problems, you could say, like bugs with the research and the testing involved. So I was just wondering if there's something other than Scrum and Kanban that you think works really well in that type of environment.
No, I have had the similar experience as yours because you are time boxing the 2-week iterations, and sometimes certain research that you are doing, certain experiments that you are doing does not necessarily fit well. Sometimes the enzyme that has to develop over 10 days, it takes more than 10 days because of some heat was not there or things like that. So I have had some experience where people come back and tell me like, okay, no, I don't want to have this 2-week where I have to either consider it done or not done because I'm constantly discovering new ideas within my own thing. It's hypothesis testing, right? A lot of those things are whether cancer will be promoted into this into this mice, for instance, if I inject it at this particular rate. They try that, but then they don't work. So they have moved into the Kanban method. And I have seen people use a combination of both Scrum and Kanban. But then again, it is primarily Scrum that you are using along with some lean principles. So Kanban will fit much more into that kind of a paradigm that you are telling. So I think Kanban is a better approach than Scrum, because Scrum will be completely into exactly the time boxing approaches, iterative delivery, and with a project management concept.
Okay.
So in your particular case, I think Kanban will be a better one.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else have questions? Yeah, I see that someone has typed a note. Discovery is not one of the uses of Agile. I agree to some extent, but at the same time, a lot of experimental innovation is also done using Agile. And so they use existing data to say, okay, what kind of new data patterns can we actually come up with, and what kind of recommended prescriptive analysis can we even provide our customers using the existing data. So I have seen discovery as also part of the agile approaches to how we come up with new ideas for the solutions. But I see your point, but I'm using it in a different context. I'm not sure who asked that question though. So these questions are very difficult to read. As much as I believe these are good initiatives, can you explain the Spira team advances to support this? Yes, I can definitely talk about that to some extent. So Spira team introduced a lot of functionality at this point. So there is a risk aspect that has been introduced, where you can associate risk with requirements, test cases, and all those things. Also with the tasks, you also have a risk workflow where you can accommodate how your risk is getting properly done. And there is that's part of Spira plan, but within Spira team itself, you have a lot of additional functionality in terms of bidirectional traceability between requirements and test cases. You can also see on the planning board from existing requirements how many test cases have been written, and you can look into that from both the backlog grooming as well as in the iteration planning as part of your your agile approaches to how you manage the backlog. You can look at those things and say, is my document, is my user story completely flushed out, or is it being understood, and all those things. So even before you come into the actual release planning exercise or iteration planning exercise, you can come there with more information about what is this user story and what level of discussions I have had with one stakeholders or multiple stakeholders, as I mentioned, and bring closure to those user story requirements so that you are able to point it and factor whether we are going to move forward. From a reporting dashboard standpoint, a number of these gadgets that you probably want, like a burn-up chart, burn-down chart, all those things for velocity or for everything else is constantly available. So it's almost real time. You don't need to do any computation on your end. So you can have a product level dashboard. You can also have individual dashboards that actually tell depending upon your role. So if you are an engineer or a tester, you may want to have code coverage of your stuff. But if you are a product owner or a project manager, you may probably want to have more about the burn down charts and things like that. So you can even size up the backlog and see whether the backlog is continuously groomed to the extent that if your team is constantly delivering at a specific rate, what should they be? How many more user stories will be required? So prep them much in advance, and based upon the existing pattern of how the team is delivering, you can even come up with an estimated hours per every point. Those are the load factors that we can even come down with. It's how many user stories can even be done. What is the number of points that you should take into a particular team. So there is a lot of things that are available over there in Spira team for these things. I believe I have answered all the questions so far. Are there any other questions for me? If not, thank you very much. I really appreciate all your support over here. Please make sure that you are able to register for the next webinar in the series, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks a lot, everyone.